Hello and welcome to the Freedom Anarchist News Review. Tonight I have with me Mike. Hello, Mike. Um, and we have what have we got on the agenda today? We've got catastrophe insurance bond hits. Sorry, sorry, hang on just a second. There we go. Catastrophe insurance bond hit record highs while the right tries to ditch net zero as there is nothing we can do anyway. Britain is screwing over its Afghani allies, to nobody's surprise, really, I think. Uh, Maja T suspends hunger strike. Suiza 6 and the Durham Miners Gala, and actually not on the list I've got written here, but possibly one to talk about because I don't think we talked about it properly in the last couple of episodes, was the starting of a new left party and how that's been going, or not, as the case may be. Um, but I think we might as well start with the Suiza 6 because you wrote it, so you can kind of tell about it, a bit more detail what's been going on.
Yeah, thanks for that, mate. So obviously there's a story on the website if people want to check it out. I'd appreciate it. But no, in all seriousness, it's a really serious story because the Suiza Six are essentially six campaigners, comrades, and a worker involved who were, campaigning against the owner of a bakery in Gijón. Um, who had essentially been alleged to have been withholding wages and terms and conditions, poor terms and conditions, poor employment practice. There was allegations of harassment as well against an individual worker. Local CNT mobilised and the CNT more generally mobilised. So it was syndicalist mobilisation against the bakery. A meeting was offered to the owner. This is going back to 2017. So this is a campaign that's been going on for a very long time. And essentially what happened was the owner didn't play ball. The CNT staged some demos outside, had an informational picket, etc. But there was never any violence. There was no violence whatsoever or anything like that. Nonetheless, after a series of legal campaigns by the owner against the CNT, I think a 2021 regional judge found the campaigners, the Suiza Six, guilty of coercion, as he styled it. And what that meant in practice was that they became liable for jail terms and for a big fine as well. Now, that's been percolating its way through the judicial system. There's been an outcry over the jail sentences and so on. But the reason it's become really poignant at the moment is because last week the Suiza Six were ordered by the authorities to report to jail and did so. So those comrades are actually incarcerated at the moment, and there's been an uproar across Spain about this. It's not just in Asturias, which is the region where there's been a huge outcry about it. It's also across Spain, across the left in Spain. There's 22 different unions, both syndicalist organisations and also what we term craft unions, who've supported the Suiza Six over this because it's been seen in Spain and beyond as a major attack on workplace organising, basically. The worker themselves has found themselves, in a desperate plight because of this. Obviously, they've been incarcerated. The campaigners have been incarcerated, and what the kind of spin or the line that I was pursuing through the article, which I think is something that echoes what the movement is saying on the ground, is that we've seen in other spaces the criminalisation of non-violent direct action recently. And so there's two aspects to this which are really, really massively concerned, obviously, apart from the intrinsic human issue, which is the attack on trade unionism generally or on radical unionism in particular, but also this criminalisation of non-violent direct action, which we're seeing. Now, in terms of food for optimism, if you like, the Communist Minister for Labour in the Spanish coalition has said, they're seeking a pardon. Yolanda Diaz is seeking a pardon for the Suiza Six, and there's a huge amount of energy behind that movement, unless they're in jail. And this is something that's rumbled on as a campaign for 8 years. And one of the groups on the ground has said, this is what the outcome of lawfare is. And as anarchists, we are very skeptical of the state. We are very skeptical of the law because we know in a capitalist society who the law generally serves and it ain't us. And that seems to be the case here. So it's a really concerning thing. It's a real sign of repression, and that's the headline we went with. A repressive trend against unionism, which I think is what it is.
Actually, it seems I mean, not surprisingly necessarily, but it seems clumsy. Into from the perspective of even a right-wing judiciary to essentially make martyrs unnecessarily. Like obviously we've been seeing this with the whole reaction to Palestine action, which obviously we have to be more careful now about how we talk about it. But obviously, there has been a very definite uptick in people as a result of Palestine Action being prescribed, who have uh, put themselves out there, been protesting, and have been duly arrested by the police for doing so. And you know, the sheer number of people doing it, and the way in which um, social media has really just not bothered stopping to to be supportive of Palestine Action in many cases. Um, and it's this thing of was it the Streisand effect, sort of written slightly in slightly different pen, I suppose, where the state tries to ban a thing, but all it really achieves is bringing to the forefront that this thing is being repressed, essentially. And obviously, as you say, the federal state is the Spanish state federal. I can't remember, but the central government is nominally a left-leaning one. So it's actually, from their perspective, this is, if anything, a plus, I suppose, in a weird way, because again, it's kind of focusing people on a kind of this is what the right will do given the opportunity, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think to your point, I think, it's interesting, who is making the martyrs and what the martyrs are and what it means. So to take the UK example that you referenced, and obviously being mindful of how that needs to be discussed, with respect to that, taking aside support for any particular group, pro-Palestinian sentiments amongst a large swathe of the population is significant. It's very significant. So criminalizing a particular group is potentially controversial in specific ways in the UK. But I think in terms of what we're seeing in Gijon, it really is. It really does backfire hugely because actually, there are elements within the Spanish Union movement who find the CNT irritating. The CNT isn't the mass movement that it was in the 1930s, say. So, there's a historical CNT and there's a contemporary CNT. And, what this has actually done is driven together the Spanish Union movement in a way that perhaps we might not otherwise have seen. So yeah, it has. I think it's very much backfired in that sense, and I think, as you say, there's a left-leaning government in power, which nominally is sympathetic. And there's talk of a pardon and so on and so forth. So it does seem a miscalculation, but then on the other hand, it also points to the fact that, you know, in this specific case, there's a lot of rhetoric around this judge was the last person that it reached, if you like. So there've been a number of different lawsuits and attempted prosecutions that have gone nowhere and then have been ruled out, and then eventually it got to this point. I think the key issue is that when the Spanish Supreme Court, I think it was last year, upheld the sentence. So, judging on a verdict of process didn't overturn the sentence, and I think that was a major thing. But no, I agree. I think realistically, this can only backfire. It is backfiring. There are a number of solidarity demonstrations planned in the near future. I think I'm right in saying the CGT has called demonstrations tomorrow, I think, and in fact later in the week as well. And obviously that's not the CNT. So there's different groups that are mobilising. There've been international solidarity demonstrations, and also the fact that El País did cover it last week. So it has escalated to the point where this isn't just the trade union press. It isn't just the radical press like ourselves. It is El País who's covering it. It is El País that is saying at the bottom of its article, this is really important because actually it criminalises trade unionism. So the fact that this is breaking into the mainstream proves your point, really, that this is something that the right may have, insofar as the right has supported this, they overplayed their hand a little bit, I think.
It's it's very encouraging. As you say, the CNT as a full-on anarcho-syndicalist trade union has quite the reputation for getting into arguments with other lefty unions and less than yet lefty unions. Um, it's always difficult sort of looking at sort of those groupings from the outside, and only seeing things via like correspondence and all this kind of stuff. But um, anything which I feel like there is room for a bit more of a rapprochement between the anarchist trade unionists in Spain. Whether they would wish it, I don't know. Sometimes you don't. But but yeah, like it's always not, it's always encouraging to see the trade union movement being able to kind of rally round under these circumstances, I think.
And I think one of the things is I think you're spot on, and there's a kind of just showing my matching t-shirts here. This was not a deliberate decision to anybody who's watching. We just have limited wardrobes. What can I say?
Yeah, yeah.
But it's all freedom merch though. So just pointing you in that direction. But just on the point you make though, I think the rapprochement is really good. It's really positive to see. Obviously, syndicalists working with other unions for the right reason. Obviously, we don't want to just work with reformist unions because. But I think one of the things that's come out of this is also actually a vindication to some degree, which might not seem immediately the case, but a vindication of syndicalism. By which I mean, what we're seeing in the rhetoric around what's happening in Spain is a lot of people who are aligned with quote unquote mainstream unions saying, well, hang on a minute, if essentially people are going to get prosecuted and criminalized for this, then actually, the whole of trade unionism is under attack, and maybe syndicalist methods aren't as beyond the pale as we might think. So, it's encouraged the debate about what tactics should be in the Spanish union space, which I think is good, and it's good generally, because obviously many of us who are anarchists are aligned to syndicalism in terms of how we put it into practice in the workplace. So it's good to see syndicalism being actively discussed in a broad format in Spain in a way that, as you say, is freighted sometimes with the CNT's historical baggage, but actually I think is really positive at the moment, albeit that obviously 6 people are suffering really seriously, and we do need them to be free as soon as possible. So free the Suiza 6.
So good way to round off the session. Before going on to anything else, we had a comment. Any thoughts on stand up to racism's antics in Epping? Other anti-fascist groups like FLAF have been criticising them. I have to admit, I have not been following the that particular bit. If it's anything like stand up to racism, usual gubbins, I would imagine it involves them in some way betraying the more direct action oriented anti-fascist set. In which case, it would be very much a I am Jack's lack of surprise kind of situation. Stand up to racism are, they can get the numbers out, and that's as much as you can say really for the most part with them, and often as not, they are extremely frustrating and prone to uh, trying to do that kind of what's it? It's the politics where you're being upstanding and um, uh, doing what the police want and all that kind of stuff. You know the one. It's respectability politics. That's the one I was going for. Jesus. Um, and in the cause of respectability politics, they will sell people down the river quite quickly. Um, in anarchist and anti-fascist terms, it's an arm's length thing with stand up to racism, I think, most of the time, as far as I can tell, at best.
So for my part, for Shane, apologies to the commenter. I'm not up to speed on what's happened in Epic. I've just done a quick search online, but I wouldn't feel appropriate to comment. But yeah, echo your thoughts. They're definitely there on the historical issues around working with stand up to racism. But yeah, I'm not across what's happened in Epping, so I will dig into that and find out. And also to the person who sent an email in that I need to answer, I do know that, so I'm coming back to that as well.
Um, all right. So next on the agenda, where have we got to? So we can get onto catastrophe insurance bonds hit a record while the right tries to ditch net zero, as there's nothing we can do anyway. So catastrophe insurance bonds, not the world's most interesting topic. I will freely admit this. However, there is an interesting note involved in it. So the basics are, if I can just pull up the story. Um, sorry, just a second. Um, I've lost the bloody page. So yeah, I mean the short version is that the insurance industry has been going through an enormous boom as a result of Um, I found it. Uh, Catastrophe bonds hit record as insurers offload their climate risks, is the story. Um, so the climate bonds um, are transfer part of the risk for events such as wildfires, hurricanes, and earthquakes to bondholders, um, and they've surged by an extra £1 billion so far this year, and that to 18.1 billion, comparing to a previous record of 17.7 billion for the entirety of 2024. So we're talking about, if it continues in the same trend, it's pretty much doubling. And this is as a direct result, according to the FT, of devastating flooding, which has hit Texas and China in the past week, Europe having back-to-back heat waves that have sparked wildfires, and the general increase in disasters, which have become more commonplace over time. The quote is essentially, insurers have no choice but to identify ways to offload their increasing risk, which they are doing via a bond market, which is essentially people, as with buying bonds in any other case, it's just sharing risk in a wider financial sense. And the more risk there is, the more the price of the bonds rises. And the rapid rise of bonds now suggests that the financial services industry has essentially said climate change is about to get, or has become, so catastrophic that we're going to start exponentially increasing the amount that we charge insurers to underwrite their risks. This will obviously impact on everybody else because insurers will pass those costs on to us if they allow us to insure ourselves at all. Obviously, in places where flooding is possible or likely, they will simply start saying, we won't insure you. And the interesting thing about it is that it dovetails with, as we know, Kemi Badenoch has been saying recently, and Tony Blair quite notoriously have been saying, there is no point in us even attempting the half-assed target of net zero by 2050. So we might as well give up and focus on mitigation. But the insurance firms and bond markets are essentially saying mitigation is a no-go. It's going to be so expensive that we are not prepared to underwrite it. So realistically, what is being said by the political class, which is we are not brave enough to take the steps, or we cannot persuade the rest of the political class and the ruling elite to go along with us in taking measures to mitigate, to lessen climate change, and the financial sector are saying we're not paying for the damage from climate change. It's essentially capitalism, in sum, as has been admitting over the last few months, it has no solution to climate change and is not going to bother to try. That's just flat out what it's saying. And nobody's talking about this. I mean, George Monbiot is the closest probably in The Guardian who talks about this stuff. But even he has, I don't think, has clocked how bold that statement is in terms of how the insurers are categorizing this. And it's, it should be, it isn't really, but it should be shocking. It should be like the fact that capitalism is just flat out accepted. Can't change climate crisis. We're just going to kind of pull on through and see how we go. And it is a fundamental, it's just everything that the anarchists said it was going to be 50 years ago. Like, you can read stuff from the 70s and 60s. Actually, you can read Kropotkin. He was saying essentially this was going to happen in some form or another back in the 19th century. But this is capitalism saying it's not us. It's not heighty flighty, lefty catastrophizing. It's not the climate change conspiracy. This is capitalism.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think you put it really succinctly there, mate. I think that's spot on, and I think it's really interesting. I think rewinding back in time, just over 10 years or so. If you think back to people probably read, many people have read Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything. And I think I'm right in saying one of the early chapters in that, because I've read it a few times, but it's been a long while. Um, One of the early chapters in that is something like "Why the Right is Right" or something like that. And the idea behind it was, at the time, it was this idea that, well, the right had to deny climate change and had to be really vociferous about denying climate change, because ultimately their view, which was also, Klein's view, was that essentially this was the game-changing argument for the left, really. That, if the right didn't deny climate change and accepted it, well, then the left has to win, because ultimately some form of, alternative system to capitalism is the only way out of this mess. And therefore, the right is right insofar as they're spending a lot of money on climate change denial in 2014, because they know that if they accept that climate change is real, then ultimately the left wins, because the left proves that the basic capitalism is a bankrupt system. And I think it shows you the changed political position now, in that no, they're not denying it, but the reality is we're in a space where people have no, the mainstream politics has no way of imagining any world beyond capitalism. It just can't. Um, they increasingly now are betting the farm on the idea that actually the public can't imagine any world beyond capitalism, and therefore, actually, yeah, to hell with it, exactly. And you're seeing politically motivated actors, obviously governments, particular governments, that are heavily targeting investment in the last few years from not nice people, but investors who've gone into environmental and sustainability funds, big investment funds, targeting those people and saying, no, you shouldn't be putting your money in those quote unquote woke funds. You should be putting them in oil and gas and so on. And the reprofile of capitalism away from, yeah, we want to do green investment 8 or 9 years ago, to now actually what we want to do is, let the good times roll on oil and gas. I mean, I think Trump even said in his second inaugural address, didn't he say drill, baby, drill or something? And actually, mitigation is the only option. So we've seen a shift because of the way the political bandwidth has shifted in mainstream politics. And I think if you think back to Klein, if you think back to 2014, that moment, that this changes everything moment, I think part of that was coming out of 2008, and it was like, well, actually, surely capitalism has to acknowledge there has to be, that it has to die now, surely. And then a lot of people said, well, actually, we've got zombie capitalism, zombie neoliberalism, since then it just carries on regardless. I think that's where we are. We're in the carry on regardless phase. And I think you're right.
Yeah.
I thought it was a fascinating article. I really did, because actually I have been onto this before. I think insurance is a really good place to look if you want a barometer of what capitalism really thinks is going to happen. Insurance and risk are really good places to look. And I think that point you make, actually, about, on the one hand, the risk is going to get spread to these investors because they can make high returns on this stuff, but also it's going to get passed on to us in premiums and so on. But also, it won't get passed on to us insofar as some of us will just become uninsurable. I think that's absolutely the case. We're already seeing that in some places. And that then has the interesting thing is the knock-on effects within capitalism. So within capitalism, then, does that mean certain areas can't be developed because they can't be insured? And that probably does mean that, but then there'll be workarounds and there'll be other options, and no doubt benevolent governments to capitalism will find ways of taking on risk for them and so on. But yeah, no, I thought it was a fascinating article, and something I'd said, it was in the FT, and the FT is not our friend, but then on the other hand, sometimes capitalists have their own form of realism, and it's interesting to see that in plain sight, as you say. Capitalism is going to eat itself. We admit that it's going to eat itself, and good luck. And that's basically what the insurers are telling us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like capitalists are very good at persuading large chunks of the population to kid themselves about stuff. But capitalists themselves are often, or usually, much more able, like BP famously, sorry, Exxon, famously had the data that said climate change was happening as a result of anthropogenic um, impacts, anthropogenic change. And then just sat on it because it was bad for profit. But they knew, and they planned, and they've been planning around it. How can we maximize profits for as long as humanly possible? And then, yeah, around 2008 to the 2010s, you see a process where they think they think they've lost the argument, so they start making moves, tentative moves to kind of, BP and Shell in particular had started to divest from fossil fuels to a degree, or at least all of their new production or additional production was starting to be much more wind and solar. And now they've rolled that back because they're saying, well, it doesn't make us enough profit. Um, because they've realized that they have managed to persuade a critical mass of people that climate change is just woke agendaism, which to my mind is the way in, all credit to the PR and marketing departments that work this out. The way in which you build an entire political identity and sell it to people as not just you hate migrants and you hate gays and you hate women with opinions, but also you hate the environment as well because you hate all these things, right? Like the way in which they meshed all of these into one coherent bundle of, I mean, incoherent in every possible way, but considered as a coherent pattern of thinking because it's not what the left wants. You know, fucking bravo in a kind of
Yeah,
you've destroyed the earth, but that was really skilled.
and the fact that it's very easy for us to slag off the government because obviously, we hate the government, so it's easy for us to do that. We hate government in general. That's the point, right? But if you take another story from the FT actually talking about Rachel Reeves last night, talking about what she wants to do and what her plans are, and growth, growth, growth being the mantra of this government. You know, going to your point about they've managed to convince everyone to hate the environment. The fact the government's saying bats and newts are the enemy of British success. And I'm like, I really don't think bats and newts are the root cause of Britain's economic problems. I somehow doubt that, but nonetheless, and I think it comes back to, I think part of it is, I think where PR and the marketing agendas and all the different lobbying organizations that have operated around this sector have been very successful is what they've been good at. I think, even now, if you look at the polling data, if you believe these data sets, or if you look at some of the data sets, and this used to be part of my job, people, if they're asked about concern about the climate, they'll say yes. If they care about the environment, they'll say yes. The issue is really around hierarchy of priorities and where people sit it and what they're prepared to give up, right? So, and also the inevitabilism, the fatalism aspect, to the extent to which people believe what they do, what they can do will make any sort of difference. That's a real issue. So when it comes back to it, if you go back 30, 25, 30 years, the old classic was, well, do you believe the government should increase taxes to pay for AN or the public service? And the answer was usually yes. But then the caveat to that was the same person will believe in that a lot of money was wasted, and therefore waste was the rhetoric. Said, well, I would do, but they'll waste it. So, and I think the same thing goes with climate change, the same kind of motivated reasoning in terms of what they've targeted very effectively is, we all think we should be greener and we should be more environmentally friendly and sustainable and all these things. But actually, realistically, I'm not prepared to change my way of life significantly. And that's not putting it on the consumer, genuinely, because it is the companies that are doing this. It's the companies that are not releasing information that would help us make informed decisions. So I'm not blaming the consumer, I'm not doing that. It is the corporations. But the corporation strategy is to demobilize people politically in this way. And it's been very effective. And again, to your point, the issue around Exxon knowing more about the impact of fossil fuels earlier. We saw it with the tobacco lobby previously as well. And then also what we're seeing now, the latest iteration that some may argue, is data centers. Data centers, the expansion of obviously first cloud computing, but now machine learning and AI. The energy costs of that are estimated to be unbelievable, by the early 2030s, more than what the world can potentially put out on current levels. But we're not getting accurate data from these companies. Now, these companies know how much energy they're using. These companies know how much energy they will use, but we don't know. So again, we're seeing the same cycle repeat itself, and it's really fascinating, but it's also terrifying.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, so moving on to our next item. So Britain screwing over Afghan allies. So this has been obviously a big story both on the left and the right for somewhat different reasons, I suppose. But Labour has now obviously called an inquiry because that's how that's how politicians deal with every major crisis these days, is call an inquiry, and somewhere 10, 15 years down the line, maybe we'll get some kind of answer which says, yeah, maybe someone was to blame, maybe someone wasn't. Who can say, really? But the guts of it, for folks who haven't read the news, is that the details of 19,000 Afghans who had applied for refugee status in the UK were leaked online, and there was an effort made directly after to cover up, well, the data was already gone, but cover up the fact that the data had leaked, basically uselessly, because the Taliban had seen it almost immediately and downloaded it. I think from a left perspective, it really the uh, lack of care taken over that data is really just emblematic of the same thing that we know about how Britain treated Afghan employees of the British state, people who were allies of the state, who had tried to help it in its imperial endeavors, uh, often for reasons which they just didn't like the Taliban, which I think is probably pretty reasonable. Um, but ultimately, they abandoned these people when they pulled out of the country, and disgraceful on the face of it, disgraceful in terms of a lot of people. You hear a lot from former soldiers saying, these people saved my life. We had to rely on them every day, and they were let down by the British state. And this is kind of another example of that happening. It's in terms of Britain once again showcasing its absolute callous approach to international relations, and fully living up to all of the reputation that it built up in the 19th century and 20th century. Um, pretty much of a vein, I feel.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I'm an historian. You look at the history. It's very interesting how the history of the British state and its adventures abroad is obviously told abroad versus here, which is a banal thing to say, really, but the perspective really does matter because actually, if you look at all different aspects of the way the British believe that they conduct themselves abroad versus how everybody else looks at it. I mean, a classic example is, oh, we're really benevolent in the field when we go fighting people and all the rest of it. British Army, historically, certainly prior to the Second World War, had a terrible reputation for not taking prisoners abroad, and everybody thinks, oh, the British Army. I mean, you look at some of the letters in the First World War from soldiers back to their families. Well, we didn't have anywhere to send them, so and this is stuff that was getting through the censor. So this stuff was getting through. I've read these
It's like, oh,
these
that's all
letters.
right. Yeah, thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, that's fine. Yeah, murdering prisoners is fine. So there's a lot of mythology about what the British state does abroad, which obviously is heavily internalized in Britain. But there's a couple of things that come out of this story in particular that I think are really interesting. I think there's a split there's clearly a split within the military establishment over this. So I think you're quite right. There are officers, personnel, senior officers even within the British Armed Forces who have, if not by, on the, in terms of giving their own name, have briefed off the record or briefed on the record rather, major news outlets that they're really upset about this. They're unhappy about this, that they feel these people have been betrayed because, as you say, they'd saved their lives or they'd done X, Y, and Z. So people have been prepared to go on the record in the military. And then on the other hand, you have a wing of the military or elements of senior officers in the military. And this goes back before this particular story or around as it was happening, who have been vetoing asylum requests from Afghan special forces in particular to come to the UK. Coincidentally, at the same time that UK special forces are being investigated for war crimes. And of course, the issue that was posited there was, well, one of these officers allegedly was vetoing these claims because these individuals might have had knowledge of British war crimes and might have been able to testify. But if they're abroad, they can't be compelled to come to testify. So there's a whole melange of horribleness in this. So there's this later story, which is a leak, as you say, of the names and identities of these people. That actually happened 2 years ago. And when was covered up, there was an injunction brought by the government. And the argument, I saw the Independent had a piece on it today. The argument the government made was, well, this was necessary to protect these individuals' identities. But as you've said, the Taliban had already seen all this stuff. It was already out there. It's just that it wasn't being reported in the British press. So again, it cover up was the order of the day. And it is par for the course. This is how the British are seen abroad as a state. They are seen as an imperialist state that betrays its allies, betrays the people that support it when it's out there. We've seen that in different iterations with how Afghan military personnel have been treated, whether it's special forces, people having their asylum claims vetoed in case they act as witnesses, or whether it's, in this case, identities being leaked and then a cover-up being a priority, albeit while some sort of resettlement scheme was engineered, but nonetheless a cover-up being the order of the day. And it's a horrific episode, but it also points to the self-mythology of what the hell does the British people think Britain is doing in these places anyway?
Mm.
You know, and if you go back to the 2000s when Afghanistan was a big news story, nobody really knew in a detailed sense why Britain was there. You'd see remembrance parades where loads of people turned up to support Help for Heroes and all this sort of stuff, but nobody really understood who the enemy was or what they were trying to do there and so on. And so the rhetoric around it has been very quickly forgotten, as have these people.
Yeah, no, it's it's always interesting watching the retrospective or the rewriting of kind of the logics of empire in real time. Like I because I was unlike with like World War II or 19th century empire and all the rest of it. You see the excuse making for British colonial India and that, oh, we built railroads. It's like, well, yeah, you built railroads to mines. It's like you didn't do it for anyone's benefit other than your own. But that's all very much a historical thing of saying, well, you can see these two writings of history, one written by the people who primarily written by the people who were affected by it, and one written by the people making excuses for it. But the way in which it gets rewritten live is an interesting one, I think. Because, I remember the original, we're going to Afghanistan to take out the terrorist bad guys, revenge for 9/11. It's like, which didn't happen here, but okay, revenge for 9/11. And to overthrow the Taliban, who are an evil fundamentalist regime. And then you get there and it's like, we're building democracy and we're protecting women and we're getting Afghanistan back on its feet economically and all this kind of stuff, which was obviously nonsense. Like you could see, like the people talking about it when they came home were quite clear that it was obviously nonsense. They were talking about it in those kind of um, apocalypse now terms, in this kind of, it's just madness and people shooting at each other, and that's what Afghanistan is. Um, and then the Taliban roll back into Kabul, and all of those excuses are proven immediately to be nonsense, right? Like you're not defending women, you're just pulling out because it's too expensive now, and all the rest of it. Um,
And a
and
similar thing, sorry, mate, a similar thing happened in Iraq, lest we forget.
yeah,
Obviously the rhetorics around them were different to a certain extent. But I remember when Britain invaded Britain, along with the US and other countries invaded Iraq, Second Iraq War. I remember the rhetoric being, well, when people questioned the occupation and said, well, you've destroyed this country, what are you going to... And I remember senior British politicians, senior British military officers saying, we'll stay there for as long as we need to stay there to rebuild the country. We will stay there decades. We will be there in 50 years, I believe one senior officer said. They were gone in 2011.
mm,
They were gone very quickly. And also, lest we forget, the British military didn't hand over to an Iraqi commander. They handed over to an American commander because they were desperate to get out of it. And that's not obviously looking at the personnel themselves. That's saying that, that was rewritten in the space of about 8 years. And going back to your point about Afghanistan, as you say, the narrative was originally, we're going after Al Qaeda, we're going after terrorists, we're going after the Taliban, we're going after, and then it became, we're protecting women's rights, we're building a democracy, and then the other one for a while was we're anti-drugs, we're on anti-drugs mission, and the justification has changed time and time again. Your point about it was like apocalypse now. There was a whole genre. I'm really interested in this, and I don't know if anyone's written anything on this. If they don't, maybe one day if I can ever write about it. But there was a whole genre of war porn that came out from about 2006, particularly around Afghanistan, because Iraq was the dirty war. No one was happy about Iraq. Iraq was one that had excited mass, opposition. Afghanistan, though, a lot of personnel were very excited about Afghanistan because it's a proper war, quote unquote, where that they felt they could actually, be engaged in a way that they found familiar, whereas in Iraq it was very different. But there was all these war porn books that were churned out, usually written by some journalists, ghostwritten for people who've been soldiers or Apache pilots or whatever. And there was all war porn. It was all like, we're out doing this, and it's, and these sold extremely well. And these played a big role in the development of sort of nationalism in this country in that period leading up towards Brexit. So there's a huge long-term impact of this, but actually it's been memory hold as to what was the point, really. But yeah, as you say, people getting betrayed in real time as well.
it's in many ways the perfect legacy, I suppose, for Afghanistan. Just the final little betrayal. Um, okay, so we have leftover, or not leftover as such. Maja T suspends hunger strike, um, which, if I can find it. So this is an anti-fascist who is in critical condition. Um, After 40 days of hunger strike, Maja T has suspended it due to deteriorating health. According to the Budapest Anti-Fascist Solidarity Committee, they have lost 14 kilos, their liver and kidneys are damaged, and their blood counts are too low. I mean, 40 days of hunger strike is phenomenally disciplined, and incredibly brave to continue as long as that, I think. Um, but it does go to show just how bad the conditions must be, um, where they're being held in isolation in Hungary since June 2024. Um,
Yeah, and I've been following this story. Obviously, our friend's written a piece for the website on this. I wrote one of the earlier pieces, and yeah, I mean, it's a horrific story. They were rendered effectively from Germany to face justice in air quotes for their alleged role in essentially anti-fascist mobilization against the fascist demo in Budapest, the Day of Honor demo, where essentially loads of neo-Nazis converged to commemorate this attempted escape by the Waffen SS from the Red Army in 1945, I think it was. And they essentially, alleged to have been involved in trying to disrupt this and, going after neo-Nazis. And they were back in Germany, obviously their home country, and they'd effectively been rendered because there was this midnight night and fog operation where they were removed from Germany to Hungary, and they've been under arrest ever since, notwithstanding the fact that the German Federal Constitutional Court said they shouldn't be extradited. Um, so they've been horrifically mistreated whilst incarcerated as well. The conditions have been awful. And I think one of the things they said when they went on hunger strike was they said that one of the things they wanted to do was highlight the plight of political prisoners in this situation. And I think they've done that very effectively because it has garnered a lot of media attention. But their demand has been to be allowed to go back to house arrest in Germany. And whilst the German government has periodically made representations to the Hungarian government, at the same time, it's been quite mealy mouthed about it. At times, they've been saying, well, yeah, these things would have been offences in Germany and da, da, da. But, even the German judicial system has been undermined by the very fact the Federal Constitutional Court ruled against the extradition. But a 40-day hunger strike, obviously horrific. What was it? I think 40, the weight had dropped astronomically, as you say, potentially long-term organ damage as well. But I think the other thing is it gives the lie to any sort of credibility that the European Union as a bloc has, given that this kind of thing is simply allowed to go on within the EU. I mean, we all know what the EU is really, but the idea of the EU is some kind of, as you sometimes hear said in Britain, some kind of liberal utopia. Is quite flatly refuted by everything that they're going through. So solidarity with them, and hopefully diplomatic efforts will result in some sort of resolution. But I think the thing that might result in some sort of resolution is people power. And there's been a lot of solidarity demonstrations. There needs to be more. There needs to be more action on it because it's a horrific story.
it's also, I think, I suspect the left parliamentarians in Germany were somewhat shocked because I mean, the Greens in Germany aren't terribly left, but as part of the coalition that uh, it took place under, they have been targeted for protests and reprisals as well. And I think that certainly the centre and centre left in Germany seems to have gotten rather too comfortable with behaving in ways which akin to Labour here, I suppose, where are they red notices that get sent out by various governments saying these people are our top priorities for arrest if they're in your country. Um, Erdogan is very notorious for uh, sending out these notices and trying to get people arrested on essentially terror charges, but they're basically just relatively minor forms of dissent. Um, and yeah, as you say, the EU is only too happy to just do these as a little favor to a government, to a friendly government. And this time, just for once, there is being a bit of a clapback over it, and not just against kind of, right-wing governments that don't care, but left-wing ones which might feel a little bit more heavily pressured by it. But
I think one of the things that came out of the recent chairman elections, obviously the government's changed, the makeup of the government's changed. Obviously, the makeup of the government is still rubbish. But one of the interesting things was how well Lincoln did compared to what was expected and with whom, particularly amongst young people and so on. But as you said, that reflects the fact that other German left parties have been very heavily tarnished by some of this behaviour and by the Ample Coalition in general previously. So yeah, no, I think there is, we've seen the story on the site now that, Green Party officers have been targeted and so on. So yeah, I mean, I think that'll continue. I think the pressure is mounting. It needs to continue to mount.
yeah, all our solidarity. Which leaves us with a happier one, or at least to a great extent, the Durham Miners Gala, which has been, yeah, like it's. I mean, we had a report on it first time for a little while. Not sort of an anarchist event as such. It's kind of uh, a broad left festival, but obviously, I think the largest in Europe of its kind. Um, and this year, it does, it's often a good barometer of what the left is thinking or thinking about in any given year. Obviously, it had a huge turnout in 2016, 2017, with Corbyn stood uh, on the balcony waving a copy of the Morning Star saying there's no going back, and tremendously wrong, unfortunately, on that count. There was very much going back. But this year, obviously, a Palestine theme. It did tend to showcase that the left, not often a united front on things, but I think in terms of Palestine, fairly united this year. Um, but one thing that did crop up was that the police were, and as we know from at least one net poll report from another protest, and I think other stuff as well, which has been going on, was that people were being harassed by police for wearing simple solidarity with Palestine t-shirts, and waving Palestine flags, on the grounds that this might constitute too much, getting too close to support for a prescribed organization. Um, I think it's worth noting that, don't blame conspiracy where incompetence is a possibility. Um, and police are not known for having certainly shop floor coppers are not necessarily known for having the most nuanced of political viewpoints. So there will be coppers who will be going around protests independently being like, oh, well, I've been told that I have to go after Palestine action, and that t-shirt says take action on Palestine or something along those lines, and therefore I should have a go at them. That's not to say that there isn't a government policy which is gently pushing towards saying if you wear a pro-Palestine t-shirt, you might get harassed, and that's a good way of slowly dampening dissent as a whole. Um, but you know, uh, I think if it ever went to court, the likelihood, as long as your T-shirt isn't actively saying Palestine Action did nothing wrong, um, post prescription, then you would be more likely to get a little payout for police harassment than you would be to be going to prison over it. That's not said as a lawyer. Don't take that as legal advice. But yeah, like that end of things, I think it's worth noting that as intimidation, it is not connected to any kind of uh, strong legal case, to say you can't wear shirts in solidarity with Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think two different things can be true at the same time, right? So I think, on the one hand, I totally agree with you in terms of, lack of nuance amongst some beat coppers, if you like, or foot soldiers, whatever you want to call them. And, I've seen, as we all probably have, because it's public domain, the kinds of things that you see under prevent counter extremism training and stuff like that. you'll see a slide of logos or whatever, and these are things that you might come across. And I've no doubt, I mean, I've got no inside information, obviously, on whatever it is the police get sent to them, but I imagine it's probably pretty similar. You sit there, there's a PowerPoint, you get told these are the things you need to look out for, and so on. And I've no doubt that, for some people, they'll just see a Palestinian flag, even, be quite, and it'll be like, oh, hang on, that's something that I saw. And, at the risk of trying to, underestimate the systemic nature of this, yeah, that could be part of it. I think the other thing, though, as well is, I think, when you prescribe one organization that's involved in this activity, obviously ostensibly for the means that that organization is pursuing, nonetheless it was always going to have a chilling effect, or it was, and I don't think the chilling effect would be unwelcome to government. I think chilling effect is definitely something government would be happy with. They would clearly like to see fewer protests and support Palestine, and fewer people wandering around wearing T-shirts just with Palestinian flags on them or anything like that. I mean, one thing that I've seen quite a lot of is people just wearing Palestinian football shirts, and I think the other thing is it doesn't have to meet a legal threshold for prosecution or for going to court and getting off or getting a payout or whatever for it to be something that where you can be given a hard time. And we've seen that time and again with the police in all sorts of different environments. And clearly, that is a thing, that is a real thing. So I think, yeah, two things can be true at the same time. There can be that lack of nuance, there can be that lack of knowledge, which I'm sure is true. And I think the second thing is also true. The government's not unhappy about the fact that there might be a chilling effect off the back of this. But another thing I wanted to come to is in Tom's report, actually, on the gala, which I thought was interesting. And this was the case even going back to those Hedy Corbyn days a little bit, was the way in which the gala is now in a geographical location where the trend line, if you like, in the politics county Durham has been away from the left. And the interesting about it, Tom talks about this in the report. One of the interesting things is the way in which they were confronted by some people who support particular far right political parties and far right political organisations. Some people on the march were confronted by them, and I think one person was alleged to have performed a Hitler salute at the rally against the marches and so on. So I think one of the interesting things about it is also that dynamic of, on the one hand, Tom saying, and says it explicitly in the article, the gala had always been seen as a sort of oasis a little bit because of the fact that the legacy of 84, as much as anything else, people in the pit villages remembered. I think Tom uses explicitly the phrase "the states of siege" that the mining villages were put under. Many of those communities have now voted for far right parties, whether at local or parliamentary elections. And so the change in dynamic there is a really interesting one. I mean, even after 2019, I think there was a big kickoff, wasn't there? Because after the 2019 election, there was somebody who represented part of Durham who was a Tory and was making a big deal about whether he was going to go to the gala or not. So I think it's a really interesting one in terms of, yeah, there's a more united front of the gala. There's a particular cause that people are rallying around, which is a good thing. But then on the other hand, it also points up the precariousness of the left in some of those spaces geographically, because actually the area around there, there's a lot of people definitely far right sympathisers these days.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of it goes to, so one thing obviously is that the left media has, in broad terms, been defunct for a long time, like most of my life. I think when I was a teenager, um, you still had like a selection of magazines you could get hold of, and The Guardian was more left wing than it is now. I think it's fair to say it was never fantastic, but it did have a left analysis of sorts, which tended to fall apart under Rusbridger and then Viner. Um, the Mirror was much more aggressively left wing than it is now, I think. Um, the which and there was less flack. So if you went, now you go online and you are constantly bombarded with more or less decent, collection of memes and uh, half facts or completely made up stuff or well researched pieces sometimes, which are pushing a right wing agenda, which isn't matched by the left at all. Um, and because there is also not a living so the way the left used to make up for it was through having a living, breathing left. So you went into your workplace, you would join the union. The union would be run by a socialist, probably. Um, your community would have a battery of unemployed people and retired people who were all lefties, who were doing lots of community organizing, and you would get to hear their analysis. Um, there was just more opportunity to come across and have argued to you a left-wing position. Um, whereas now, the level of alienation from community is so great that you don't know your neighbors really a lot of the time, particularly in London, actually, but big cities in general, this is an alienation factor. But in smaller towns, um, you have simultaneously a feeling of decline and loss, not just in jobs, but in terms of like the town centres have been hollowed out. Um, you know, third spaces is an overused concept, but there's a partial reality to them, in which, you used to go down the pub and talk to people in the pub and all the rest of it. Um, and it all kind of dovetails towards a situation where you are constantly battered by weird right-wing content, and there's not a lot of kind of um, people talk about echo chambers of the left, but actually it's echo chambers of the right, to an incredibly large degree, where people are just constantly being bombarded with this stuff. And you see it in the incoherence of right-wing positions, where you have people, I talk to people who um, I have a local food co-op which I go to, and the at this food co-op I have conversations with people um, who come from the left, but they will have startlingly right-wing conspiratorial viewpoints, which they have picked up. And you know where they picked them up. They picked them up from kind of bits of the internet, odds and sods, right? Um, and they're very easily debunked. Like you can very easily say, well, no, this doesn't make any sense, and this is why. And you're doing it in a comradely way. But like that's the norm for most people now, I think, is that you don't have that living conception of solidarity and kind of socialistic thinking. You're just an isolated, atomized individual trying to pick your way through a kind of narcissistic hellscape of people telling you to be more selfish and that you need to be alpha and that migrants are the cause of all wrong and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, of course, the left vote declines under those circumstances. Of course, people turn to places like Reform because Reform just sell to that exact market, right? Reform don't have a coherent political policy in that sense. They have a grievance culture, um, in the same way as Trump does. It's more tailored for British miserabilism, but it's the same basic process. Um, and Trump is now in trouble, of course, because by playing to those weird out there takes, like the Epstein thing, is like the thing which is currently unraveling Trump in a more dramatic way than you might necessarily think, is that he's lent on these pillars of conspiratorial thinking. And when he then comes up against reality, I actually don't think that there is an Epstein list which writes in great detail about all of the mad nonsense that Trump and co did. I don't think Epstein would be that stupid. Like, you might have some evidence on people who you want to um, who you want to have leverage over, but you're not going to have it in a little black book where anyone can find it. That would be lunacy. um, so I don't think they're lying when they say that there isn't an Epstein list. I think there might be occasional files they don't want to release, but I don't think it's this kind of totemic conspiracy of the deep state and the left and the Democrats that was built up. They're just being hammered by the fact that they made hay with this in electoral terms, and now they're coming out the other end of it, and people are saying, "So where is it?" Um,
Well, I mean, they Absolutely right, right? They harness the energy of what was then called QAnon, right? This conspiracy theory about the left elite and all this sort of stuff. That and I think the if anyone can remember back that far, Pizzagate, which was supposedly this pizza place where the Democrats had organized all this horrific stuff from, and da, da, da. And then Epstein was the kind of sequel to that in a way. Um, and as you say, the point isn't really whether this list exists or doesn't exist. The point is really the fact that they said it did and they leaned into it so hard. And to the point where even after they took office, I think I'm right in saying the AG said it was on their desk and they were going to
Yeah,
release it or
yeah.
something like that.
Stand by it.
And I think, there was some like a lot of these things, there was like photos of binders and stuff with like, this is the list or something on it, and because of that, they're now in a situation, or he's now in a situation where a significant part of his base is, you're betraying us by not releasing this information and so on. And yeah, leading into, I mean, this is the old, this is the old issue, isn't it? If you drink from this sort of well, you will end up poisoned because, there is, if you're going to try and, if you're going to play to this kind of audience and you're going to amp it up, there is no way they won't be satisfied. You've got to keep going with this thing and you've got to keep finding new enemies and so on. And eventually you become the enemy. So yeah, and, I think you're right. And I think come back to your point also about the kind of the way the ecosystem is overused, but the media ecosystem, the world in which most people inhabit most of the time. I'm not on social media currently. I've got a Blue Sky, but I only use it for sport. But but I came off social media last month, and I do this periodically because I just can't take it. Do you know what I mean? I just
Yeah,
can't take it. And the reality is when I am on social media and I don't follow any of these sites or whatever, all this stuff that that people do bask in, but you don't have to. You just have to be a member of your local community group. You can just be a member of like the streets around me or whatever, the neighborhood group, whatever. And you see people posting memes about ridiculous stuff or what they think of migrant hotels or all this, that, and the other. And it's all there. And obviously it's being pushed. It's not accidental. This stuff is being promoted. But people buy it. People believe it. People buy into it. You see these comments below the line about, like, for example, when I was living back up in Liverpool, I'm a Scouser, if anyone had noticed. But when I was living back up in Liverpool, in one of the groups there, somebody posted something about, a ward at a hospital was going to be closed down or something. And then the next 20 below the line comments are about, the Facebook comments are about like, oh yeah, and yet immigrants are getting X, Y, and Z and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, no, they're not. They're not. And this has got nothing to do with what you're talking about. But this is just what you're going to parrot because that's been baked into people over a very long
yeah,
period of time. So, and exactly, the point that, where's the counter public? Where, as you say, the kind of spaces in which people can find themselves or socialize that are different. And even as I'm old, right? I'm legitimately old, but but I was born under Margaret Thatcher. Only a few months under Margaret Thatcher, which gives me age away. But I was born under that government. And so, I was 18 years old before there was a Labour government, and the Labour government that we got was essentially a Thatcherite government. So the art of the possible in terms of mainstream politics has been non-existent for, most of the last 50 years. So on that basis, yeah, absolutely. And what the right's been very good at, as you say, is finding a way to just communicate very straightforwardly to a load of people who are lonely, scared, atomized, and increasingly marginalized, often by the politics of the right in the first place and policies the right has pursued. But nonetheless, they've been able to feed, if you like, the kind of narrative constantly to those people, and the left hasn't been as good at it, and that's the reality. And part of that is because our institutions have been smashed.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a canard in which the left, I think it makes an excuse that it's very easy to come up with simplistic fear mongering and exploit that to wind people up and make them scared and all the rest of it. And it's much harder to explain um, sensible left-wing politics and why they're important to people and kind of debunk all of these scaremongering tactics. And it's like, well, it is and it isn't. Like the left is too verbose, I think it's fair to say. Um, but it's also the left's strength was always in direct interaction. It was in reminding people that we are all human, and that we are not, in fact, just surrounded by monsters of our own, imagination, or of someone else's imagination if you've been reading too much Daily Mail. But it's we struggle, I think, because we spend too much time on their terrain and not enough on ours. Um, we spend a lot of time mirroring their language, mirroring their tactics. Um, we talk about kindness whilst not being very kind a lot of the time. Um, and and that's not to like put a blame on people. I think that it's I do it myself. I'm a people who know me will be well aware that I'm prone to the occasional snarky comment online. Um, but that's a factor of us being trained in the same way as the people we're trying to, we're saying people have got themselves um, up in a twist about stuff. We've also been trained to think in a particular way and react in a certain way and act in a certain way. And we kind of talk about. I occasionally say, when people ask me, "Are you an anarchist?" Then I'll say, well, if I'm feeling particularly pretentious, I'll say, well, yes and no. I'm an anarchist in the sense that I want anarchism to occur. I cannot be an anarchist because I live within capitalism, and therefore all of my thinking and all of my interaction with the world is as someone who lives in capitalism. I can't be an anarchist. If I was to live in an anarchist society, I would struggle in that society because I'm not prepared for it. I'm not trained for it. A post-revolutionary society is one I would have to, you know, be a transitional moment towards. That's the best I could ever manage. So that's my pretentious take on anarchism. But in a similar way, we are part of the same media construct, the same social construct as everyone else, and we interact in the same way. And often those ways are playing into that construct and reinforcing that construct unintentionally, but that's what it's doing.
I
Um,
totally hear what you're saying, and I think I think you're too hard on yourself, by the way. Albeit with the even if you call it pretentious, but yeah, because like I know what you mean, but at the same time, yeah, I think you're being a bit hard on yourself. I think I know exactly what you mean. I think the issue is, come back to your point, we can't escape the fact of the environment in which we were, created, formed, socialized, right? And for, as I say, for the fifth, the 5 decades, or the most of 5 decades that I've been around, I've been inculcated every stage with social Darwinist thinking, right? Now, I like to think I've usurped that. And I think that, to me, that is the barometer of whether you're an anarchist. Are you able to break that program? And is that where you're able to get to? I like to think that I broke that program at this point. But as you say, you keep slipping back. There's always mistakes that you make. There's always things. But yeah, exactly. We had that drilled into us through the school system, drilled into us actually in more an informal education, through marketing, through consumerism, through even the way sports talks about. I'm obsessed with sport, but even the way sport is talked about, we can tell a story about sport, team sport in particular, that's completely mutual aid and cooperation. Or we can tell a story that's about competition, and the story that tends to get privileged is the one about competition. There's and that filters into all our culture in all sorts of different ways. So I think that is a huge challenge, and I agree with you. Sometimes, yeah, we're not, we don't model the things we say in principle we believe in. Being nice, for instance. One thing that just one little random aside, one little thing that I've tried to pick myself up on is I spent years and years and years apologizing in terms of foresighting somebody or bringing somebody into a conversation. So, for example, before I mentioned Naomi Klein, now in certain circles a few years ago, I'd have said, "Oh, Naomi Klein, I know there's all sorts of issues with Naomi Klein," and I would have said that as an offhand, terrible, if I might say, um, holier than now anarchist way of saying, "Well, Naomi Klein's not an anarchist, therefore there's things on which we disagree with Naomi Klein. Therefore, I have to say something as a caveat to
yeah,
prove that
just
I'm still an
caveating.
anarchist." Do
Yeah.
you know what I mean? And now I just don't do that anymore, on the basis that unless somebody's done something really bad, in which case I will not reference them probably. But if somebody just happens to have a political viewpoint that is different to mine, but they say something that makes sense, I don't bother apologizing for citing them. Do you know what I mean? And it's little things like that where you really realize that, like, actually, Naomi Klein probably wants 95.8% of what I want. Do you know what I mean? You know, we differ on some things, but at the same time, what they say is actually really important and it should be heard. So I think, yeah, just those things about like how we can change ourselves is really important. It is, it matters, it makes a difference. I should listen more, you know, and that thing's also been a thing. And social media doesn't promote listening. Social media promotes you got to pump stuff out and have tweets and have hot takes and stuff. And I try
Yeah,
to
yeah.
become more considered about what I write as well. So, you know, yeah, I think we can all change. You know, that sounds a bit happy clappy, but we can all change.
I
So
think
yeah,
I think that is the perfect way to end a little hippie note of optimism. All right, yes, and we have in fact hit over our hour. So thank you very much, Mike. As always,
pleasure, mate.
a great
Always.
conversation. And I shall